All right, welcome everyone. We're just gonna give it about a minute to let a few more people trickle in, but thanks for hopping on time, and we'll get started here in just a second.
Those people coming in.
Nice. All right, well, I think we've got a pretty good group here, so we'll be mindful of everyone's time and get right into it. So again, welcome to How to Shift Left, People, Process, and Technology. My name is Nicole Jones. I'm a product marketing manager here at StackHawk. And with me today are your expert hosts, StackHawk CSO, Scott Gerlach, and PagerDuty security engineer, James Berthoty. So before I hand it over to them to get into the meat of the webinar, I just want to run through a few housekeeping items. So throughout the webinar, we're going to launch a few polls, starting with one right now. So if you want to go ahead and just take some time, this will just help us learn a little bit more about you and your goals, so we can kind of adapt the conversation as we go and make it relevant to you. But keep an eye out. Like I said, there'll be a few more, so just watch for those. And we would love for this session to also be interactive, so the Q&A and chat will be open throughout the whole duration, so feel free to drop questions or comments in there. We'll try to answer them throughout the webinar if we have time, but if not, we'll get you answers at the end. And as far as after the webinar, you can expect to receive the slide deck and the recording, and any other relevant resources that come up throughout the webinar. So I'll just give it, actually, I'll leave this open for just a little bit longer, but Scott, you wanna take it away?
Sounds great. Thanks, Nicole. A lot of pressure, James. We're experts today, so we've got a lot of thinking to do. So ground rules for our webinar today. Ask questions, like Nicole said. If we know the answer, we'll give you the answer. If we don't know the answer, we will not make stuff up, unless, of course, we do make stuff up, in which we will tell you about. We will preface it with, that is totally made up. Don't listen to what I said. Hi, I'm Scott Gerlach, as Nicole said, CSO and co-founder at StackHawk here. My background is in security, so I spent 20-some years as a security engineer, security analyst, security architect, security manager, CISO, before we started StackHawk. Like I said, I was the CISO at SendGrid for 3 years. Last job at GoDaddy was senior security architect. I worked there for almost 10 years. I am also a husband, a dad, a golfer. Startup life makes me brew less, Nicole. This is, I think, a goal that I should have, brew more beer. And then just general tinkerer of things. If you want to talk to me or get a hold of me on Twitter, there's my Twitter handle, and then also my LinkedIn URL if you want to find me there and chat. James, tell the people who you are.
Yep. Hey, everyone, I'm James. I came into security up through the systems administration path. I feel like in security now, there's like the dev path, the sysadmin path, and the standard security path. And so mine was more that sysadmin side. And that's why I really think I'm more DevOps at heart, but found myself in security, trying to do shift left at the last few places I've worked. Little fun fact about me is that I wrote for Team Liquid about StarCraft 2, so I'm always happy to talk StarCraft. And yeah, similar to Scott, I'm always happy to connect with people and talk more, whether it's on LinkedIn or Twitter. So, yeah.
Awesome. We're super excited and privileged to have James. He's wicked smart, does a lot of talking engagements, a lot of thought leadership stuff on LinkedIn. So make sure you follow him on LinkedIn, because there's great content coming there. Okay, so I guess, Nicole, next poll question is coming up. I got a question for you, James, and everyone else who's here. In application security, what is harder? Finding or fixing? James, what's your opinion here?
Yeah, I think I want to answer slowly to let people pick before I've influenced anything.
Influence the answers.
Yeah. I can say for sure My initial task in cloud security was our CISO saying, figure out what the devs and the CTO are doing and make sure that it's okay. And so that, I think, is most people's thrust into like shift left or cloud security, is like, what have these devs done with the credit card? And that's the finding bit, is definitely the emphasis out the gate. But then I quickly found that the harder problem is by far fixing. And my biggest mistakes in trying to do this well have all been around trying to focus on finding first, and then realizing, oh, this is actually going to be a complete nightmare to fix these 4,000 alerts that look so cool in a demo call, being able to see like, oh, this has 3 buckets, unencrypted, whatever. But then trying to fix that requires a whole nother skill set. And like we'll talk about later, just relationally as well as technologically to achieve. So
yeah, I kind of feel the same way. When you're starting to look at tools, the finding part is really cool, right? They're like, there's a bunch of stuff I don't know about, and this thing is telling me about the things I don't know about. But that's not where the rubber meets the road as far as vulnerability management and resolution. So I always think, and historically, this has been true for me, and I think James as well. Interestingly, the poll is like half and half. We're kind of split here. So if you are in the finding camp, I'm guessing that there's a lot of people in the, oh, sorry. Yeah, if you're in the finding is harder. There's a lot of people that might come work for you that are into the fixing part. Okay. But I always think that the poll thing keeps moving on. I always think that fixing is the harder part. And fixing is usually the harder part because of things that James talked about and just misalignment in what different teams are doing, right? So when you talk about security teams and their priority is often, and sort of how they often get measured for success, is like, how much stuff did they find? How many risks have they identified? Whereas development teams, specifically when we're talking about AppSec, they're measured about getting stuff out the door, right? How many features and value can they get out the door, and how quickly, and how much churn do they have on that? So a lot of that is just competing priorities, when really everyone's priority is the same, right? Or should be, is creating value for the company. So I always think about kind of the AppSec problem is a lot of the wrong people doing the finding at the wrong time and lacking the context of those kinds of fixes. I don't know if you think about that or describe it differently in your teams, James. Maybe you do, and I would love to hear that. And if anyone has any questions or feedback, hit us up in the chat. We're happy to continue having a conversation about these topics as we go through them. But James, how have you described this or done this or undone it in different jobs you've had?
yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to do is just think about a couple like concrete examples that I can remember doing that really drive this home, where it's like, the first time that I was implementing secret scanning in pipeline, like that's an important thing you should do. And just running TruffleHog first, which is just an open source project for discovering hard-coded secrets, and then finding them. And then that's great. And then I pull up GitHub's walkthrough on like what it takes to fix that. And you're like, you're pulling a jar that someone made to like sanitize the entire commit history. Then you're basically having to change branch protection rules to do like a force push that wipes out and creates basically an entirely new commit history that's redacted. And that's the details of the fixing part was so much harder than just running TruffleHog on a repo. But that's definitely where it's the most like entertaining place to be from like a security side, is like, I want to like play with the new tool and use it. But then getting the findings fixed is the hard part. And I think I especially see this with like the way that CNAP has become the new vendor sort of hot topic of the day, cloud native application protection platform, as sort of the evolution of CSPMs, of cloud security posture management tools. And all of those, as CNAP has sort of evolved into broader AppSec, and like checking a lot of feature boxes, I especially see that problem of like, how many people have used a tool, whether it's like Prisma or Aqua or Sysdig, and you get the vulnerability output and it is just like insane to deal with. But like you found them all. But getting those over to a dev team can start a never-ending process of trying to get things fixed. Because essentially the evaluation criteria was, where are we going to get the most findings, and not how are we going to fix the most things.
Yeah. I mean, that's a super good kind of segue into why we're talking about shift left, right? And so the lack of context and the finding at the wrong time thing that I was talking about is exactly what you were talking about, which is, after commits have been done, or when we publish things to prod, or 3 months after someone's done working on a project or done working on a sprint, or sometime after everyone's like, cool, on to the next thing. That's typically when we find stuff, and it's not bad. But if that is your only frame of reference, only context, you're creating this like sort of bad interrupt loop where people have to go recontextualize themselves into what they were working on, or how it runs on their machine so they can debug it, or lots of different things. Or maybe the people that worked on this thing aren't even there.
Yeah, and that's
Go ahead.
the technical details really come to the surface there once you know what you're trying to fix. And I think that secret scanning is a great example, because of the you learn from that process that the key, basically the only feature you should look for, is pre-commit scanning of the secret, whether that's happening at the IDE or through like a hook happening like GitHub's does, and GitGuardian has this functionality as well. But like most evaluation criteria for security teams I've talked to have been like, what type of secrets does it detect? How many projects can it handle? How can it report that? But it's all of those evaluations are sort of missing the only thing that really matters, which is, when can we stop this commit from happening?
Yeah. When can we find it, and how does that feedback land back at a developer?
Yeah, for
Right?
sure.
Really, the heart of shift left is, how do I get people the right information at the right time to make better decisions? Because I think people are already making decisions today. They're just making passive decisions. Let's get them to help make active decisions, which is a different problem. So that, as security people, we can do our job of trust and verify, not trust but verify. The but implies you didn't do the trust part. Trust and verify is what I like to say. So let's talk a little bit about why shift left, the benefits of shift left, and then we'll jump into some of the how. So you can just kind of read through the slide here if you want. But some of the real benefits here are just what we're talking about. We're talking about being able to identify security problems while we're writing code for the application, code for the infrastructure, code for the, whatever your development team is in charge of, which is a litany of different things depending on the org, right? You're either a dev and then an ops shop, or a dev and then a DevOps shop, or a all DevOps shop, and developers are in charge of everything, or just code, or some version of this journey or path. And the whole point here is to be able to inform the people who can actually do the fixing. So, typically in AppSec, there are pockets of these groups and teams out there that can do finding and fixing at the same time, and their specialization is security, and they are hard to find and hard to hire, and hard to keep on staff. Typically, the fixers are the people who wrote the code, or wrote the Terraform, or wrote the CI job. If we can help give them the information at the right time, that feedback loop is a little bit better. So I know James has some examples of bad feedback loop versus good feedback loop. But it helps with the rest of this stuff, right? Context of the priority of the release versus the security thing. And this is, I like to think of security bugs, which is what they are before we put them in production, as tech debt, because they're tech debt, right? There are other pieces of tech debt that our engineering teams are introducing and smartly taking on when they're talking about it in sprint planning or whatever, they're not talking about security issues because we don't show them to them during that time. So accruing tech debt. Wow, I really wrote this as a tongue twister. Accruing tech debt smartly is a really good thing to help empower people. And then obviously there's some other stuff. James, tell me about some of this context stuff. I know you've seen good. I know you've seen bad. Maybe some examples of getting through this and what good actually turns into.
Yeah, I think the first key thing has to be an organizational desire to be proactive instead of reactive with security. Because the reactive, to go back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like starting at the runtime and working backwards, like that's always going to be reactive. And it's what a lot of security teams are really used to. Like it's the status quo to like find the issue at runtime and then go back and try to fix it later. And the way to create organizational buy-in to that's not a good approach really comes down to a lot of financial metrics that you can use to actually help with that. And so the easiest one is always compliance, right? Compliance is, I always think of like speak softly and carry a big stick, and the compliance is the big stick of like, oh, there goes our SOC 2, there goes our PCI, because we didn't want to turn on branch protection, or we didn't want to have developers have to review pull requests. So that's always like the last resort option for creating buy-in. But I just, from experience, I'm shocked by, if you start going down the wrong path here, the amount of staff and work and even churn, because the day-to-day job is so awful, you can create by trying to do that work backwards approach. And so I think of things like having to hire multiple full-time vulnerability teams because their job is to parse through 10,000 lines on a CSV export every month and assign those to different development teams and meet with them, as opposed to something, a tool that's a tool and a process, like we'll talk about, getting those findings directly to the developers automatically. You've not only reduced the need for 5-10 staff people, but beyond that, you've also made the jobs that those people can do. So it's not like you're using it to reduce headcount, but those people don't want to be doing those jobs. Like they'd rather be doing something like deploying new tools, looking through code, trying to find vulnerabilities, working with customers, working on compliance type architectural design things. Like those are the fun parts of security. And so really, I think the financial incentives all exist around the time to fix is decreased, the staffing needs are decreased, and really bubbling up that alongside the compliance story of like, ultimately, like this is the direction compliance is heading in, so we don't have a choice anyways, kind of creates the 1-2 punch of like, we're going to have to get here anyways. And it's going to really help optimize our team if we do it faster rather than slower. Yeah.
I found a weird orange hammer in the office yesterday. I was like, look, it's the compliance hammer. I forgot to bring it home, but I agree with you that the compliance stick is effective, but it doesn't create buy-in, right? It's more, usually when that happens, you get some point in time buy-in. You get like, okay, to get through this compliance thing, we'll do this. And then we're going to go back to doing what we did before. And then next time compliance comes around, everyone's going to run around again to do our point in time stuff. And you haven't created a lot of buy-in. And, I've been talking about a lot of measurement metrics that security teams can help measure themselves on. And compliance is one of them and is necessary. But I also like to think about things like customer trust and how that turns into retention and churn rate and expansion. Like, do people buy more of your service because they A, like the service, and B, trust the service? I think those are really interesting things to talk about, and they are the things that the exec team is talking about. So in talking about metrics that you can influence with the security program that the exec team is already talking about is also an interesting way to differentiate yourself as a security team, and B, have more influence with why should we do any of this, right? If you're trying to introduce a new thing, a new concept, a new metric to an executive team who it might take a while to understand that new metric, versus pulling at the heartstring of a metric that they care about and look at every day, one of those is going to be more successful, I think.
Yeah. And I think this stuff becomes the biggest challenge when you're in an org where people don't know that there is a better, because they haven't done shift left or they haven't used more modern tooling. And so the challenge, like, I just think of how much collaboration I've gotten from working with DevOps teams in different places by coming in and saying, like, yeah, this tool does suck. Like, we should move to this thing that's way better. And they're like, oh, there's stuff that's better. And they like want to help implement, design, use it, because they're desperate to get off of the old thing. But that requires you to know that there's a better way out there than what you're currently using. And I think that applies. On LinkedIn all the time, I just try to like really make things simple for people in terms of like the Sneak, StackHawk, Sysdig set of applications, like is the set, not because like I know we're on a StackHawk call, but not because like I have some special vendor relationship with people, but because like I've used other tools to try to accomplish these outcomes, and it's been just headache inducing trying to get it done with like just one or two people on the security side. And I can have great relationships with 50 developers, but that's all basically wasted if I'm not able to if I just have this giant backlog that's too much to deal with.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, that brings us to the next part of our little webinar here. And the next poll, Nicole, if you could launch that poll for us, that'd be great. That'd be great. So we're going to talk about the how, the things that you got to do the how in shift left, which is the whole point of the webinar. And we're going to set it up like this, which is why the poll question is what it is. We're talking about the three-legged stool of successful org change. And I want to know, oh, yes, people have heard of it. What's a stool? Who wrote that answer? That's silly. We're talking about the three things that you kind of have to do to have successful org change. Like, you can buy technology and implement it, but if you don't have people and or process change that go along with it, you are usually not successful, or you're limited in your success. So, yep, people, I have heard of stools, but have you heard of chairs? Yes, I've heard of chairs. Chairs have four legs, and that does not work for this analogy. If you have not heard of the three-legged stool, this is a Bruce Schneier thing that he made famous. He also borrowed it. But again, it's really about the effective ways that you can affect change in the organization. And those are the people, process, technologies. And typically when people say this, I think they say it in that order on purpose: people, process, technology. But I want to pose a question to you, James. Do you think that it is a linear three-legged stool? Can you build each of these pieces in isolation?
I think that this is a interesting question, because you could make a case for any of those. And so I think that's why it would be tempting to say yes, is because I could come out with a great little 30-minute by my ebook case for why people's the most important, why technology is the most important, why process is. But yeah, ultimately, it really is so specific to every organization and requires hitting all three sort of at once.
Let me pose it. Let me jump back into our chair analogy and pose it this way. Do you think it would be easier to build a three-legged chair if you built each of the legs of the stool independently, or if you designed them all kind of together to be the same shape and size and made of the same wood?
I just know when I get it from IKEA that it's got the 3 legs in there,
Yeah.
and I
Well,
just screw them in.
fair enough. All right. So the punchline here is I don't think it's I don't think it's a linear process. I don't think you can go, hey people, we're going to do a new thing. All right, now I'm going to go talk about the process. And then I'm going to figure out what technology can serve that process. I think that's weird. I don't think you can buy technology, then go, and we're going to design the process, then try to go get buy-in. That might be how we as security teams usually do stuff. And which isn't super successful all the time. And I also don't think you can go design process before you understand what the technology is that can support that process. And then finally, again, talk to the people to get buy-in on that process. So I always think of it as a little bit more like this interdependent three-legged stool, right? So we're going to keep talking about each of these things, but I think you have to be able to say, I need people buy-in to help me design process, but I have to know about technology and what it can do before I can design the process and get people buy-in at the same time. Then do those things, then go get technology. So I think it's like this kind of thing that you got to keep doing around the triangle stool, whatever silly analogy we want to talk about. Any additional stuff you want to add to that, James, or disagreement?
No, totally. I think the hard part for a lot of people is figuring out the outcomes ahead of time. Because you learn so much as you're growing in each one of these things, right? Like I'm not going to know that, oh shoot, my principal architect wants to roll his own authentication system, and I was like getting ready to push Auth0 as opposed to that. Or shoot, I bought a CNAP because it was all in one, but it does this other thing like really terribly, and like I don't know what we're going to do about it. And so the way that I tie the outcomes is really closely aligned to looking at the DevOps pipeline, or even the QA goals. And I know that sounds kind of strange, as like it's not like a typical place to start, but the reason for doing that is that the DevOps pipeline especially has been designed to solve problems and create outcomes. Like it's not usually people who are just like kind of looking for something to do, and so they created like Argo CD to maintain deployment stuff. Usually that stuff is really battle tested in terms of like it is getting pushed out in order to solve business needs. And so if I can tie back into that pipeline security every step of the way of like, all right, what is this build job doing and how are we going to secure that job? Because then I'm immediately thinking about like, do I have the right people? Like I'm going to need dev teams across the org. I'm going to need a process to make sure that I can block builds early in pipeline before the build happens or when after it happens. And I need to make sure I have technology that's going to work there. And sort of that pipeline, I think, will also tell you how ready you are for certain technologies. Where if you don't have a staging environment, and things are just going straight out to production in your pipeline, then you're probably not ready for any tool that is primarily based on scanning a staging environment. And similar sorts of stories each step of the way, in terms of building the prioritized list of tools, because especially right now, I mean, just thinking about how quickly the tools and the outcomes people are going for are evolving. You really do have to be tied into that rapid evolving nature of DevOps. Yeah. Because I'm just thinking about like how now it would make a lot of sense to have a tool that's like an Argo CD integrated deployment blocker. But like 5 years ago, that would not have been on my radar at all as a priority.
Sure. I mean, look, every organization continues to evolve, hopefully, over time. So you're not going to design the perfect thing. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But you have to be able to understand goals of these team members that you're interacting with, whether it's DevOps teams or engineering teams, to help design an informed process or know what process already exists and how technology might fit into that. But let's do this. Let's start with the first one. And I like to do it the other way. We're going to start with process. So process shift left is the process that we're talking about. But I think the really important part is, what does it mean in your organization? And James, you just started talking about like the Argo CD stuff. So where and when and are we testing, and who's doing what? Do we break builds or block builds? What to fix and when? Who gets to make these decisions? These are all super important pieces of the process. And I've seen it work in a lot of different ways, and I've done it in a lot of bad ways, right? So
Yeah.
not understanding the build process and the pre-deployment process is probably the number one holdback in designing a shift left solution. Number one, who does this stuff and what happens inside of it? Probably the number one thing that holds back security teams from being able to do shift left correctly. James, what else have you done / seen?
Yeah, I think on this point, especially, you have to have a lot of flexibility in what you're willing to do. It's why I appreciate like the sneak approach to sort of getting visibility and blocking stuff in each part of this, where it's like, I remember the first SaaS vendor I went with at another company was my primary selection criteria was the number of true positives versus false positives and the depth of those findings. And they had an IDE integration, and you could run it in pipeline with like a jar. And so I thought like all the boxes are checked there, but the piece that was missing was realizing that like most of our devs at that organization didn't use good IDEs, didn't use plugins in them. They were all very new developers. And so I created a Confluence page on here's how you integrate this tool into your IDE, and no one used it because it just wasn't how things were done. And then are getting that jar to run in some of our repos that were not already built with like a Java base somewhere in the image was also really hard. And so like basically we selected the wrong tool because we didn't understand the process for devs. And that's where really having a willingness for the security team to get down and dirty with those teams, I think, is the crucial step. I've everywhere I've worked, I've felt as though I didn't have the respect of the development team until I made my first commit, which is not something that especially traditional security people, like if you're like a SOC analyst or a content developer, like people aren't expecting you to make Git commits, but like learning that process is essential to understanding and being able to empathize with how things are getting done in your organization. And it's going to force you to meet the people that you need to meet when you're like, oh, how do I actually connect to get this deployed? Or why is this so weird? Or that seemed really difficult. And you're like messaging people like, why was this difficult? Like, is that something? And they're usually like, oh yeah, we know it's terrible and whatever. And so really the first step to me is getting involved in that process, and learning it yourself. And that's something that at PagerDuty, we are super huge on. Like for the onboarding, it is deploying your own microservice within the first, you have like a month generally to is about how long it would take someone, unless we've obviously seen it very short, but that time frame really helps with getting everyone on the same page of understanding like the infrastructure, the processes, and not relying on their like historical understanding of how stuff might happen.
So when you're doing that deploy a microservice training, what are they generally teaching you? Are they teaching you like, here's how most development works at PagerDuty and the similar kinds of services, and like, are you trying to blow up somebody's two-way pager, or are you trying to send text messages, or what's the kind of what are the things that you're learning when they're teaching you that?
The goal is just to get code in a Kubernetes cluster, right? Is like the outcome. But what you're learning along the way and this is where at PagerDuty, we've really done shift left super well, in that our devs feel empowered and capable to do their own terraforming, their own Helm charting, their own development work on the actual code side. But I want to also just think about organizations that are less mature at that, where like there is a separate DevOps team that's doing the Terraform, and what they're teaching through similar processes. That's where the security team member has to like cognizantly be curious to reach out to that team, where it's like, I'm just thinking of the other places I've worked where there might be a similar onboarding for like deploying a microservice, but there's a lot of like DevOps magic that just sort of happens to get their thing in the cluster. And it's being curious enough about that to go ask the DevOps team, like, oh, what is this deployment job doing? Or like, can I get access to Argo CD? Like, what's that look like? How does that work? And so really, to go back to the goal at PagerDuty is to really get everyone on the same page quickly about the standard template for how we deploy services.
Yeah.
And that's touching the Terraform, the code, everything.
Yeah, smart. So, I mean, a good rule of thumb here is if you're looking to shift left and you're not sitting with at least one engineering team, just kind of learning how they prioritize work, how they commit code, how they review code, how they deploy, build code. You're not doing that, you're already down maybe a bad path for shift left. So if you're not doing that, go start doing that. We were joking about if your development team has Notepad++ for IDEs, go to the Get a Real IDE webinar first, help them there, then come back to here. No, I'm kidding. Stay here. We want you here. But the thing that I really love about what you just said was this thing that we talk about a lot. And I think it plagues a lot of security teams, even when they're evaluating technology. And it's not starting in this is how it usually works. This is how normally things happen. This is how normal applications get designed, built, deployed, etc. And what we typically do is start on these edges. Like when we think about risk, we're like, okay, there's that one application that no one's developing on anymore. It's sitting out there and it makes just enough money that the entire executive team is like, we're not decomming it. I want to make sure that it can test that. Like that is a great place for manual people testing. Spend time wisely. So as you're thinking about this shift left and understanding how development teams and engineering teams and DevOps teams do their work, think about this middle section. Think about how can I design myself into here so I can free myself up for those second and third standard deviation areas.
Yeah, I think having vast experience across the company, like working with a lot of different individual contributors can really help here to understand what that common ground is. Because I think of so many times where like you could get thrown off so badly, like if you've only been meeting with your like chief architect and like he's using Emacs or something, and then all of a sudden you're looking for like, how am I going to integrate this with it becomes your top priority. Just because out of ignorance of knowing what really is the standard process like you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I also think that it's part of like every security person, well, most security people I've worked with have that built-in paranoia. And I think that's what guides us to those like edge cases where like the first question we usually ask is like, okay, well, if this is scanning in pipeline and it blocks a build, how are we going to make sure that only approved developers approve it through the build? And then once you've done that, it's like, okay, well, then how are we going to make sure that they're not just doing that flippantly, that there's some evaluation process, and you end up creating like processes on processes out of this like paranoid driving of experience, when I think that's something that happens with really advanced security teams, but it's realizing that for most places, like the fact that you have visibility into something, like just to use open source scanning as an example, like if you have the ability to see if log4j is running in your application, like you have a level of depth that a lot of organizations don't have. Because their best option is to like beg a senior developer to like write a script that's going to run on all their servers that like looks for the package or looks for the class or something. And so that's where just focusing on like the net wins that are really going to help you, as opposed to those edge cases of fixing the really nerdy stuff or trying to build layers of complexity.
Yeah, I think it brings us kind of to the end of the process part, which is you're not going to design the perfect system the first time. I think everyone sort of knows the Moltke quote or some version of it that's like, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. But I think this is even harder because the development team is not our enemy. They're our teammates. We're all in the same place to do the same thing. So you kind of have to get this constant feedback from these teams that are involved and make sure that you're evolving, not designing perfect. Perfect is the enemy of good. We're going to talk about a framework for the people here just in a second, but I think when you're talking about shift left, you really have to get feedback from developers, DevOps teams, development leaders, product teams, all of the people that are involved here.
Yeah, especially because every org does it so differently, right? Like what's the difference between a platform engineer, an SRE engineer, and a DevOps engineer? It's like that. Well, it depends on where you're at. And so really getting to know your development team well, which the best that can be really, because I'm interested in your perspective from more like that leadership perspective of how you've helped build those bridges. The way I've done it has always been hopping on the P1s, hopping on the outages, trying to look at like joining the DevOps Slack channel and like looking into the questions to see if I could answer them, trying to ask follow-up questions to people, see who's answering stuff. Like it's really a lot of like just trying to get hands-on with those different teams is really what I try to do from the engineering side.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's a thing that I advise all of my security team members. Go sit with engineering teams and like, don't be creepy, jump out of the ceiling security person, but like just sit there and listen and absorb what's going on, what problems they're trying to solve. And then start suggesting like, hey, I think the security team can help you do blah. Or, there might be some experience that you have from a previous company or previous experience that you can be like, oh, I've seen this done exactly what you're talking about. And here's problems that we ran into to be aware of, just in case no one knows about it. And just be a helpful person instead of a lot of people see security teams as the department of no. Undo that, right? Yep. Oh man, our security team is very helpful, so that you start building some of that trust and some of that understanding of what's going on there. That brings me to a really good next part of what we're talking about here. Maybe the hardest part of all of shift left for security teams. People who need people. So where are we going? Where's my clicker? Uh-oh, I lost my clicker. There we go. All right. This is the one that gets skipped, and it's probably the hardest. The question that I have for you, James, who's your dev leadership champion at PagerDuty? Who's championing shift left at PagerDuty?
It is always everywhere, a lot of different places that I've worked. It's this balance of like, everyone wants to say that every developer is a security champion. And then you quickly run into the, like, if everyone is, then no one is situation. And so really what I'll say as far as like dev leadership, especially at PagerDuty, is we are constantly evolving what this looks like to meet the standards. And so I can think of times, both historical and now, where we have actual security champions on development teams. And I can think of times when we've been close knit with our more DevOpsy teams to achieve goals. And so really, I think the dev leadership champion is just, for us at PagerDuty, is like everyone is willing and view security as helpful genuinely. And that is, I think, a top-down kind of commitment that happens to we are going to care. Because I mean, at PagerDuty, our number one concern is reliability, right? Because especially in the concepts of incident response, like
that's whose number one concern is reliability. That then turns into PagerDuty's number one concern is reliability. I would say that that's PagerDuty's customers. That's the thing that drives the top down reliability thing. I'm curious, not to cut you off here, sorry. I'm curious who is the one that's like security in the development process shift left. What we're doing with shift left is paramount to what we're doing. And so I'm the CEO or I'm the CIO or I'm the CTO or I'm the VP of engineering, and I buy into this. Therefore, the rest of my organization buys into it.
Yes, I think our CISO has great relationships with the rest of the executive level team, up to the CEO is heavily involved in our compliance efforts and our trust building efforts. And so I would really feel comfortable saying that most of the senior dev leaders are legitimate champions for shift left, and recognize the importance of it here. Awesome. And I can reverse that as well in terms of places I've been where that's less the case. And there the challenge is really trying to show slowly that the shift left is important and happening, and building those more organic relationships, as opposed to people being very willing from a cultural perspective to like hop in. Because not every dev culture is going to be as good as it is here, where people are super friendly, willing to engage, looking to help out. Sometimes you've got like the persnickety devs who are working away in their feature and don't want to talk to anybody. And so that's when you have to really try to build those organic connections.
Yeah, I love that. I've kind of experienced the same thing, where when you get somebody who's not going to go, wait, why are you doing security things? Stop doing that. We need to get this feature out the door. When you get somebody that's like, why are you doing security things? Oh, that's important. Keep doing it. You're much more successful in influencing what kind of work and when can be done in development organizations. So make sure you're understanding who is that person, why this should matter to them. And the answer is probably customers. There's probably no other answer. The answer is probably customers. And kind of talk about it.
Yeah. And I remember I did like a consulting call with an organization somewhat recently about like just willing to have a frank conversation as a security team of like, is this tool / outcome a realistic priority for us right now? Because you have to realize that for every one of these tools, for the CNAP stuff, you're getting you are railroading DevOps priorities, because you're going to need their help to deploy the Helm charts and get everything up and running and bypass stuff to run pods with elevated permissioning to be able to do what it has to do. Same with adding things in pipeline security workload. Yeah, just really having clear priorities that are built with those teams in mind, both ways. So like at PagerDuty, increasingly security teams are involved early on with development work, and development teams are involved early on with security work. And it really has to have that clear conversation both ways to help do prioritization.
Yeah, great. I want to talk about a friend of mine here real quick. This is my friend Frank. Technically, this is Frank the Tank, because at this point in the movie, if you know what we're talking about, he's totally hammered. Now, this is not going to work in your organization. And this is Frank, and he had the great idea to go streaking. And if you remember the movie, you'll remember that He had a great idea to go streaking, and he did zero work convincing anyone else before he got to this point that they were going to go streaking. So he hadn't built a coalition of streakers, as I like to call it, to be able to convince more people to go along with them streaking. And what he did was go announce that we're going streaking. Everyone was like, what the hell is that guy talking about? He went streaking by himself, and then he got picked up with his wife in a car. And she was like, what are you doing? And he said, we're streaking to the quad. And she was like, who's we? It's just you out on the road here, man. So the streaker mentality of I'm going to go headlong into designing processes, buying tooling, and not talking to people and not building a coalition of people that want to go do that with you, definitely will not work.
I think that's one of my major lessons learned going from like ReliaQuest to PagerDuty and seeing the scale of a public company from a private company. And then even earlier in my career being at very small startups is just with that scale, that becomes even more important to try to do, because like in a startup environment or in a smaller company, you can kind of try to streak or maybe like get your friend going with you.
Yeah.
But
in a startup, if you get your friend, you got like 50% of the company.
Yeah,
that's a good majority or a good percentage of the company. But you're right. Like it becomes more and more important as the organization gets bigger. Keep saying what you were saying.
No, because I'm just thinking about trying we're doing similar implementations that I've done elsewhere, and just the scale of those implementations becomes way harder when you stop talking about 50 repos and you start talking about 1,000 repos and getting visibility and prioritization and vulnerability counts. Like the scale of the conversation really requires a more careful process ahead of time than just like, yeah, we'll kind of figure it out once the scanner is deployed.
Totally. I want to kind of help people with some clear role definitions for shift left. This is the rapid decision framework. James, I don't know if you know the rapid decision framework. I think everyone has heard of RACI, but the thing that happens in RACI that I don't like is there's a lot of people talking and no one gets to be the decider. So that's why I like rapid, because you've got recommender, agree, people that are doing the work, performers, and then who needs to have input. And then there's a decider, right? There's ultimately someone who's like, yes, let's do that. Who can be the tiebreaker if everyone disagrees, or can be the like champion if everyone's like, we're all on the same page, we're going to go run at it. So I put some suggestions in here as to what teams are what. So I think obviously we're talking about a security thing here. So I think security team is probably the recommender. I think if you're going to ask development to do work, they should agree with you. They should be the agreeing on what's happening here. Obviously, perform is development, largely in shift left. And then input, we're talking about security development, probably a DevOps team or a CI team or whatever you call them at your company, people that instrument the build deploy system. James, who do you think the decider should be?
I'm a big product led guy. And at the end of the day, part of being in security has to be being willing to suck it up. If it's like, I think this tool or category would be a great initiative for us, and make that case, but then at the end of the day, it's not the right product priority at the right time. It's not my job to come in and
any of
sort
the other things in here that you disagree with?
No, I would just add for perform that I think it works best when, if there was like an asterisk that security is willing to perform, is the huge piece that can go wrong here. Like if you buy a tool with a process with the assumption that, oh great, now all my vulns just go to the devs and they just fix them. Like you're putting a little too much on the perform.
No magic bullets here. No magic bullets.
Yeah.
So I kind of agree with you. I had a little bit more contextual stuff here. So I think the decider is the development or product team, somebody who's deciding what work people are doing. They've got to get involved in this, and you're talking about them agreeing as well, right? So somebody in development leadership or product leadership has to agree to what we're doing. Your development teams and your Security teams have to be involved in all of this stuff. But I think I think the development team or maybe the product team, depending on how your organization works, is probably the decider, the yes, go or no go. So I love what we're talking about there. We've talked a little, I think everyone maybe is feeling a little bit more confident about how to do the shift left. We know we need our teams involved in our automation teams, our first line remediation, and our security teams into what we should fix. The reason we're talking about development leadership is, as a security person or an AppSec person or AppSec leader, or even the CISO, how many of these teams that we're talking about are you in charge of, and or can you direct work and priorities for? And that is exactly why we need that dev leadership or product leadership to be involved. So I think now, James, let's talk about the fun part. Let's talk about technology a little bit. And what kind of things, let's go, I don't want to do that slide because that's a different part. Let's talk about some table stakes. This one is obviously very StackHawk tailored, but tell me about your table stakes decision criteria for when you're evaluating technology and thinking about how that fits into processes that you have today and serves people that are going to end up doing the work. What other things are you thinking about for kind of table stakes stuff in technology, James?
Yeah. I think so much of the first thing I try to do on a vendor call with someone is assess if this technology was built for the security team or for the product / DevOps team.
How can you give some people some hints how you can tell that kind of stuff? Like, what are you looking for when you're like, who is this built for?
Yes, it's how quickly we're talking about things like CLI integrations, how quickly we're talking about things like pipeline integrations. Like I think about, because CNAP, I think, is built more for security teams. So part of what's going on in my head too is like, is this in the CNAP space? And then that kind of goes to like one side of my brain, because I do think those tools are built for security teams. Because they're focused on that runtime detection, which is why I love the emphasis that Sysdig does, really focusing in on runtime and less on the like vulnerability type stuff. And then, so that's one quick box that happens. But then assessing, is this for developers, is really a lot of what you have listed here. But ultimately, like, what my first step, because I would want people to leave this webinar with like, what's the first thing I can do, like, to start trying to do shift left at my organization? And it's like, go in your Git repository, ask for permissions if you don't have it already, clone down a repo, and then run a scan of something against that repo. And so if your tool, the harder that tool is going to make that very basic workflow to do, the more it's not built for developers. It's built for security teams, because that's like the developer's daily workflow. Like, yep. The idea that like cloning a Git repo is absolutely trivial to a developer, but to a junior security person or someone who's not on the development side, it's maybe something they've never even done before. And so the tool being focused on that sort of CLI stuff that happens tells me very quickly if it's built for devs or security people.
Yeah, awesome. Hey, we're getting towards the top of the hour. We're going to run a little long. We're not going to wrap at the top of the hour. Please hang out with us. If you got questions, start getting them into the Q&A and we'll start getting through them. Just to kind of recap something that we've been talking about here, the dichotomy of technology solutions. You have to understand the technology to be able to design the process and empower the people. And you shouldn't get the technology without designing the process and empowering the people. So there's I like to think of it as a nice little slicey razor that you have to split really nicely. Any other tips and tricks you want to talk about real quick, James, while we're sourcing questions from our participants here that either you've done terribly and botched and you want to share that experience with people, or magical, like, oh my gosh, moments that got you to kind of where you are?
Yeah. The first one is no developer is going to really let you in unless you commit something. Like I tried for way too long to get by being a security person without contributing anything to the actual product stuff. So that's first thing. Another thing is in tool evaluations, it is absolutely essential before the POC. I've done enough of these that I can like do it in my head at this point, like try to picture how fixing a vulnerability would go. But really during a POC, especially, like fix a vulnerability. And that's going to tell you everything you need to know about if that tool is the right choice or not. Because so many tools demo so well with like, here's our scanner, it does this thing, here's all your buckets, here's all your cross-site scripting stuff. And then the security team can be like, wow, look at how nice this dashboard is and prioritization, and I can export it to Jira. Like, this is great. Then I can just assign it straight. But it's not until you actually go to try to fix something that you can realize like, oh, this tool is providing zero helpful information to developers. This comes to mind so much for me on the container scanning stuff, where it's like Sneak will tell you, go from this version to this version, and you will fix these vulnerabilities. Whereas almost every other tool just says like, this vulnerable package exists in your container. And it's like, awesome. I'll go do nothing about, like, I like try to research what that is. Like, you're just creating so much struggle without realizing it. And part of that.
So when you say try to fix a vulnerability, are you talking about yourself, or are you bringing somebody from development who theoretically we're trying to ship this work to into this demo to kind of work through this with you?
If the tool is so good that my junior developer mind can fix it myself, then that's amazing. But more realistic is also evolving actual engineer, because they're the ones that are going to be doing the fixing. And so it's possible that I just think for me as a security person, if I'm able with zero context to fix a vulnerability on someone else's service, then the tool is really helping me a lot to be able to do that. And then I think it's okay to make the assumption that it's also helping developers a lot, like if I'm able to do it. But generally speaking, if you're not already hands-on, if you don't already have development experience as a security person, that's where you definitely need to walk through that process with someone. But that's where it gets hard, where we talked about designing the process with the people. Is not every developer at your company has done this before with multiple tools, or maybe with any tools. So they might not even know good from bad, where, they're taking a finding that I would know at this point is really bad and giving them zero context.
Yep.
And then they're taking an hour to research it and figure out what's going on. And they just don't know that there's something better out there. So that's the balance there.
Harold, I saw you raise your hand. I'm going to enable your microphone. If you have a question, please ask a question. If you don't have a question, shout out your favorite basketball team. Hopefully it's the Nuggets. And then I'll take you back off. All right, here we go. There's Harold.
Hey, sorry. Yeah, that was just an accident, but Nuggets for sure.
Oh, okay,
Nuggets.
great.
Yeah.
Perfect
Sorry
answer.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to take you back off. Okay, we got another question in the Q&A here from Mark. Mark said, being a developer who's moved into DevOps SRE world, getting devs on boards is a quick win for security tools, but management focus on price and not convinced by ROI. What advice would you give to help them understand ROI of shift left?
Oh, that is such a good question. Because a big challenge, first of all, the market right now is so hot that you shouldn't go off anyone's list price. And I'm allowed to say it. Well, whatever. I'm not on our sale. I was thinking about how I'm not on the sales team anywhere, so I can say that. But Like,
Sounds like I need a PagerDuty discount. All right.
yeah, well, and that's why I bet, because I was like, well, I'm StackHawk discount too, like discounts all around for everyone. Most vendors are very willing if they know, like, hey, we have this sweet deal on our existing solution and we want to go to you guys, but we don't want to give up that deal. Most vendors will work with you to create a transition plan that actually works. It's just important that you like let them know that you're considering it. So that's one thing that's like on the try to get the pricing downside. And then on the other side though, of like showing the ROI, it really requires a level of confidence of showing that like there is a better way to do this. That doesn't involve, because if you're running an outdated solution, the pain point is probably on the DAS side is what comes to mind, just since we're here. Like, you're getting a bunch of findings that are total garbage and missed. The scans are taking hours and hours to run. It's a super, like, it's providing no actual value. It's just compliance theater of like, here's all of our quarterly findings from our scanner. And the ROI to the CISO is both showing one, this is taking a lot more time to manage than it should be. And second, it's providing zero value. So we could either pay $50,000 a year for zero value and a ton of wasted time, or we could pay $150,000 a year and actually have real security value and have more time back to work on other projects, which means hiring less people. I try to be careful with this because it's such, I was a security engineer on enough calls at a company once to know that the dream is to sell the product as like, if you buy this product, you don't need to hire this person. And I think that's really what the shift left stuff can enable, is like, if you were for as expensive as some of these tools are, if you were to try to buy a cheaper tool and hire even just one or two people, it's going to cost you probably double or triple the tool cost to do that.
I think I love those answers. I'll give Mark, thank you for asking the question. I'll give you some ideas that I have as well to push on this a little bit. And I've used this not just here where I'm selling tools, but at other places. And I think the ROI comes into how much time are you working on managing vulnerability backlogs, trying to convince people to do work. How much time, when you do convince somebody to do work, how much interruption that provides into sprint work or whatever that is. Does it mean that you have to undo an entire sprint to work on security stuff only? And then the last one is, if you've had an interruptive incident of some sort where you had to like shut down development to go deal with an incident, there's a lot of money in that. And the last one, this is how you tug on management heartstrings. The last one that we usually do is SLAs. So SLAs are the savior of vulnerability management, insofar as we have written down in a policy that says, if we find a high or a critical or a super critical or a mega critical or a uber critical, we will fix those instantly. And then the management team on the other side spends a lot of time doing SLA exceptions. So I like to think that SLA stands for, so let's always not do that. And then SLA exception to me means, so let's always not do that, except we'll do that part later as well. So talking about the pain that the other teams have is really how you sell the ROI. Selling the ROI of it frees up the security team, I think, is less impactful to anybody except for the CISO. And so talking about the pain that you're trying to solve for the other team is really key to that ROI. So again, you got to understand how that pain affects them by sitting with them and understanding what's going on there to be able to talk about it. But I think those are some really good tips on how to talk about ROI with some of those other team members. I got another question. James, Mahir asked, I'm a data engineer. Can you please speak shortly about data security and how it differs from application security? You're taking the first shot at that one.
Yeah, if there's anything, that's such a good, I feel like this doing shift left for data is still like emerging in terms of like how we're going to do it. Because I've been in so many meetings with compliance teams talking about data tagging, and I have never seen data tagging like actually done well. And I'm new enough at PagerDuty that I can say that because I haven't looked into it yet. But it is just like, to me, people focus so much on like the specific, there's a big miscommunication that happens between compliance saying like, we need data tagging, and the data engineer who's then thinking like, oh, I need a new metadata column for every row on this database, or so, like trying to create a formal data structure. But what actually people want is just like a diagram that's like, this circle of databases is our scary stuff, and like this circle of databases is fine. And so I think starting at that architectural level and then working backwards from there of like, are we hand jamming stuff in our production PII sensitive data, or are we running migrations? And is it in code? And then backwards working to like start with like general informal tagging of databases, and then moving into specifically, you know, which tables does this data actually live in that's bad, and similar initiatives.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think some of the things that I think about when I talk about data security is, A, as the data engineer, you know where all the data is, help the security compliance team understand where the risky stuff is. And then B, I think AppSec and data security go hand in hand. And the reason I say that is because you can protect data from internal misuse or attacker abuse, but almost necessarily the application that is handling the data has to have access to the data. And so I think they sort of kind of go hand in hand. And you see that when you talk about stuff like SQL injection in application security, or command OS injection, or tons of these other injection vulnerabilities that could allow you to export data if it's not protected the right way, whether that's with logical separation or encryption or lots of those different things. So I think they go hand in hand. But as the data engineer, I would say probably the very first place to start, if there's nothing else going on, is talk to the security team about where sensitive data is, what their perception of sensitive data is, where that might be, and then things you can do to help them understand how that gets accessed and used.
Yeah, that's just to add to that as well. The how it gets accessed is usually something that's missed as well. Like I remember an actual SQL injection that I triaged in a past company. There's a lot of confusion to like, oh, who cares? Like, this is just like a sorting table. But they didn't realize that like that pod had like admin connections to other tables basically from within that. And so that's where, yeah, having that level of detail that you can bring as a data engineer working with, like in the context of the DevOps and dev teams, to really bring the whole story together.
Yep, good stuff. All right, we're going to go to the recap slide here, just in case some other questions come into our Q&A. Some people have left. I get it. It's lunchtime. I'm also hungry. James is hungry. But thanks for everybody who's still here. Thanks for hanging in with us. Just some of the recap stuff. Treat AppSec like a business problem, because it is. Shift left security testing. There's no magic. We talked about that. You have to design new process and include the people that are in part of the process. No streaking, at least not alone. Like if you can get enough streakers with you, then the streaking is good times, because the cops can't catch you. Anyway, not speaking from experience there. Distribute and document these decisions. So you make sure there's a source of truth. And when I say that, I'm talking about who's made decisions about what issues or findings or vulnerabilities or whatever you want to call them, who's made decisions about them and when. Don't worry about absolute correctness, right? You're not going to design perfect. Don't worry about absolute correctness, but make sure you've got a source of truth somewhere. I would be a terrible co-founder / sales guy if I wasn't talking about the StackHawk and Sneak Magic Quadrant in Gartner that just came out. Remember, tools can help you inform what's possible. They don't magically break silos for you. You have to go do that work yourself. And then also just part of that normal, the first standard deviation. Remember the normal workflow designed for that, because those outer pieces, second and thirds, are where you should probably be putting more manual effort, because you don't have to worry about that middle. James, any other things you want to add to the recap?
No, I mean, I'll I'll go harder on StackHawk for you, because I know that you're
Wow.
biased, but it really is. Since StackHawk was really one of the first DAS that I got to work with, and I was very blessed that I was able to have that approach, because since then I've worked with other ones and been like, oh God, like this is nightmarish what's happening. And so I think it's important what you said, where like tools can't break silos, but a bad tool can definitely create silos. And so that's just something that, and I'm always happy to talk with people again about different tool selection stuff, because there are like, as much as I sell Sneak, StackHawk, Sysdig, I do think there are times when other solutions might be a better fit depending on where and timing and the company size, and that stuff can be really complicated if you haven't been in different sized organizations before.
Yep, fair enough. Hey, I appreciate the shout out. This is definitely not a StackHawk ad. It's more about helping people figure out how to do this shift left stuff. There are some of these tools that we've been talking about today can help you. So if you go understand what they can do and how that can fit into your process and empower your people, all the better for everybody involved. But it's really about making sure that you're tackling those three things.
Yep.
Nicole, I think let's wrap. Let's do some cleanup, some administrative what's next, and get us out of here, because we're all starving.
No problem. All right, thanks for that great session, Scott and James, and thank you everybody for hanging out with us and sticking on and asking good questions. So later today, you'll receive a follow-up email with your copy of the recording and the slide deck and ways to get in touch with us. So be on the lookout for that. And with that, thanks everybody for joining. Thanks, Scott and James.
Special thanks to James for joining us. He's feeling a little under the weather, so I know he's got to go get some meds. But special thanks for him spending an hour and 18 minutes with us today. A little longer because of pre-recording, but I really enjoyed talking with James about his experience over a couple different weeks and meetings and stuff. And I hope if you were at this webinar, you attended it, you're seeing it later, whatever, I hope you took something away that's helpful in your shift left process. Everybody have a great day. Let's eat.
See ya.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.